Hey there, sleepy traveler. Welcome back to the channel where history isn't just learned, it's softly whispered while you drift off into the dusty dreams of centuries past. Tonight, we're diving into something less than luxurious. No kings, no quests, no enchanted swords. Just dirt, and lots of it. This episode is about medieval hygiene, a topic so misunderstood, so mythologized, and so mildly disgusting, it's practically bedtime gold. So before we scrub away the centuries, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy hearing about what monks did with their toenail clippings. Drop a comment too. Tell me where you're tuning in from, what time it is, and whether your pillow smells better than a 14th century goat barn. I truly hope it does. Now dim the lights. Maybe light a historically accurate candle. And as the modern world fades away, imagine yourself in a place where the word soap is more theory than practice. Let's begin with a simple, soothing truth. You are cleaner than a 14th century nobleman. That's not an insult, it's just science. If you ever feel guilty for skipping a shower, just remember, in the Middle Ages, not bathing was considered a virtue. Or at least, a wise health choice. Bathing, they believed, was dangerous. It opened your pores, those mysterious gates to the soul, and allowed disease to slip in while you were vulnerable and, worse, naked. This wasn't just medical opinion. It was theology, philosophy, and good old-fashioned medieval anxiety, all rolled into one musty tunic. Sure, public bathhouses existed, especially in cities like Paris, London, and Prague. But they were problematic. On paper, they offered warm water, a quick scrub, maybe even scented oils. In reality, they were hotbeds of gossip, matchmaking, low-level scandal, and, in some cities, full-blown intimacy spas. So naturally, the church began frowning, then banning, then excommunicating. Nothing says clean soul like a lifetime of dirt on your ankles. If you were rural or poor, which was most people, bathing at home was even less glamorous. First, you had to fetch the water, a heroic act involving buckets, rivers, and an enthusiastic cow blocking the path. Then boil it over a fire that took 3 hours to coax into existence. Then fill a leaky wooden tub, ideally one that hadn't been used to brine fish last week. And don't get too excited. The whole family shared that water, in order of seniority. So if you were the youngest child, you were soaking in what can only be described as ancestral broth. For those special few who did bathe regularly, monks, nobles with too much free time, or hypochondriac merchants, they might own a personal tub. These looked like half-barrels and were often placed in the kitchen, because that's where the warmth was. Practical. Also a bit horrifying if you've just made soup in the same pot. Soap, by the way, existed, just not the bubbly, lavender-scented kind. Medieval soap was a DIY project made from animal fat and ashes. It smelled like a fire at a medieval butcher's shop, which, coincidentally, is where it was invented. But even if you were clean, by local standards, you had to be careful. Smelling too good might arouse suspicion, witchcraft, immorality. Or worse, you were trying to impress someone. In a time when romance involved dowries and political alliances, personal scent was a red flag. So next time you take a long bath with bath bombs, candles, and a lo-fi playlist, remember, your medieval ancestors would have assumed you were dying. Picture this. It's nighttime in a humble 13th century cottage. The fire is fading. The wind is howling. A rooster is inexplicably awake. You blow out your candle, pull your wool blanket up to your chin, and settle into your mattress, which is made of straw. And something moved. Welcome to the medieval bed, or as we might more accurately call it, a low-budget wildlife sanctuary. Let's start with the basics. If you were poor, and most people were, your bed was likely a pallet, a thin sack stuffed with straw, hay, or reeds. Not hay and straw. That would be extravagant. The sack itself was made from coarse fabric, often rough linen or burlap, which was about as soft as a grumpy hedgehog. And yes, these mattresses were basically bug buffets. Straw was warm, cheap, and abundant. It was also the Airbnb of medieval insects. Fleas, lice, mites, and the ever-popular bedbug thrived in this dry, cozy environment. If you slept on one of these for long enough, you could probably name your roommates. They certainly knew you. Now, you could try to reduce the infestation with herbs. Wormwood, lavender, and pennyroyal were popular additions, sprinkled into bedding to deter pests. Think of it as medieval aromatherapy if your idea of relaxing scents includes bitter herbal panic. Some even sewed these herbs into little sachets to tie to their bedposts. Charming, but ineffective. If you were lucky or painfully bitten, you might take your mattress outside and beat it with a stick. This wasn't symbolic frustration. It was pest control. The idea was to chase out the bugs before they chased you into madness. Elevating the mattress helped. Wooden bed frames became more common as you climbed the social ladder, but even the nobility wasn't safe. Their feather beds, thick woolen blankets, and embroidered hangings were insect Disneyland. Parasites didn't care about titles. And of course, let's not forget shared sleeping arrangements. Families often slept together in one bed or on one pile of straw, meaning if someone brought in a few extra fleas, everyone got a turn. You didn't sleep alone. You slept with your siblings, your livestock, and your local insect population. Pajamas? Not a thing. Most people slept in their day clothes because they didn't own anything else. Or they stripped down to a long nightshirt, which was usually washed quarterly. At best. And cleaning the sheets? That was an ordeal. Linen was expensive. Washing it meant hauling water, heating it, scrubbing it, wringing it, and hanging it to dry in a climate where it rained half the year. So instead, people just shook out the worst of the debris, flipped it over, and called it fresh. Some beds were passed down as heirlooms, which is heartwarming until you realize you're inheriting 3 generations worth of mites. So, if you've ever complained about your memory foam being too firm, or your duvet not matching the decor, remember, your ancestors slept on hay bales covered in bugs, next to a snoring uncle and possibly a goat. And they were grateful for it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Nothing says relaxing sleep story like talking about ancient sanitation systems. But trust me, if you've ever hesitated to use a questionable public restroom, tonight's tale will either make you feel better or never complain again. Let's begin with the basics. Indoor toilets didn't exist, not unless you were royalty or lived in a monastery with a particularly generous abbot. For everyone else, using the bathroom was either a daily ritual of shame or a full-body adventure. If you were a peasant, and again, odds are high, you had a wooden bucket behind the house. Maybe 2, if your family was feeling fancy. It was called a chamber pot, and yes, it lived in the corner of your bedroom, next to the firewood and grandma. When it filled up, and it always did, you, or more likely the youngest family member, would carry it outside and toss the contents into the street. Yes, the street. But not before yelling "Gardez-lou," a phrase borrowed from Old French, roughly meaning, "watch out for the poop." It was both a warning and a medieval apology. Like a honk, but with more risk. The street, by the way, wasn't paved. It was dirt, mud, and the collective digestive history of your entire village. Add in horse droppings, spilled ale, and whatever seeped out of the tannery, and you have a sidewalk so horrific it could file its own complaints. If you lived in a city like London or Paris, you might have access to public latrines, also called houses of easement. These were communal wooden benches with holes, suspended over a pit of sorrow and fermentation. Privacy? None. You sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers, trying not to make eye contact while pretending this was normal. Nobles had an upgrade, the garderobe, a hole in a stone wall that dropped waste into the moat below. Which sounds clever until you remember people sometimes bathed in that moat. Or worse, your enemies might climb up through it to infiltrate your castle. Yes, real medieval sieges included sewer sneak attacks. Now, let's talk about toilet paper. It didn't exist. Most folks used leaves, moss, or scraps of cloth. If they were very lucky and rich, a bit of wool. If they were unlucky, their own hand. Which is why handshakes weren't popular until much later. Some monasteries used communal rags on sticks, cleaned, allegedly, between uses. Let that image swirl around your brain for a minute before you fall asleep. And of course, once you did your business, there was no flushing, no soap, no hand dryer making weird noises. Just you, your questionable hygiene, and a mild existential crisis about how normal this all felt. But perhaps the most fascinating thing, people adapted. They created latrine laws, waste regulations, and even sewage fines. Cities hired men called gong farmers to clean out cesspits, usually at night. It was dangerous, smelly work, but someone had to do it, and they were paid surprisingly well. Hazard pay, medieval style. So next time you're stuck in a gas station restroom with a broken lock and a suspicious puddle, just remember, at least no one's throwing waste out a window above your head. Progress. Let's begin with a simple image. You're 25 years old. By medieval standards, you're seasoned, possibly married, possibly already a grandparent. You flash a smile, except you don't, because smiling shows teeth, and that's where things get crunchy. Toothbrushes? Not a thing. Toothpaste? Technically, yes. Comfortably, no. The medieval approach to dental care was charmingly improvised. People might chew on twigs, specifically from aromatic trees like willow, birch, or hazel. The ends were frayed into bristles, making an ancient form of toothbrush. Effective? Sort of. Pleasant? About as much as brushing with a splinter. To clean their teeth, people also used powders made from crushed herbs, ashes, eggshells, and occasionally burnt bread, which is basically brushing with artisanal charcoal, centuries before influencer toothpaste turned it into a wellness trend. Some texts recommend rinsing with wine, vinegar, or urine, depending on your source of wisdom and your level of desperation. Spoiler, wine was the favorite, not for oral health, just for forgetting you had any teeth to worry about. And then, of course, there was pain, a medieval constant. If you got a toothache, and everyone did, it was a matter of time before someone pulled it. Who? The barber, naturally. In medieval Europe, barbers weren't just there for haircuts and beard trims. They were also your local dentist, surgeon, bloodletter, and all-around medically unqualified enthusiast. Look for the red and white barber pole. Those colors represent blood and bandages, not candy canes. Tooth extraction was done with metal pincers, often by candlelight, with no anesthetic beyond strong ale and shouted encouragement. The tooth was twisted, yanked, and if you were lucky, came out in one piece. If not, well, you'd better hope you liked soup. And remember, no antibiotics. If your gums got infected, that swelling in your jaw might spread. Fever, chills, delirium, and then you'd meet the medieval medical response. More bloodletting, or possibly a priest. Dental decay was rampant, but oddly, not always caused by sugar. In early medieval Europe, sugar was expensive, a luxury only the rich could rot their teeth with. The poor stuck to bread, gruel, and root vegetables. But here's the twist. Gritty bread, often made with millstone-dusted flour, slowly filed down your enamel. Chewing your way through a crusty loaf was like sandpaper in your smile. By 30, many had missing teeth, blackened gums, and breath that could qualify as a siege weapon. Mouthwash? Please. If you were very refined, you might chew herbs, mint, parsley, or clove, but mostly to mask the smell, not fix the problem. Kissing was rare. Marriage was not about passion. It was about alliances, livestock, and mutual survival. If someone loved you with medieval teeth, that was real love. In short, oral hygiene was medieval roulette. You took your chances, lived your life, and occasionally lost a molar in your mutton stew. Still, for all the misery, there's something oddly comforting here. They tried. They chewed the twigs. They boiled the vinegar. They passed down toothache remedies with the same reverence we now give skincare routines. So next time you floss, or forget to, just remember, your ancestors would have killed for minty mouthwash, or a dentist who wasn't also trimming your bangs. Let's imagine you're getting dressed in the 1300s. Step 1. Open your wardrobe. Step 2. Close it, because it's empty. Your medieval wardrobe consists of one outfit, maybe two if you're rich or recently pillaged a monastery. And that outfit? It is everything. Workwear, formal wear, pajamas, raincoat, possibly funeral attire. Because yes, you could be buried in it. If you're a peasant, your go-to ensemble is a rough wool tunic, unlined, undyed, and unflattering. It's basically a medieval snuggie that itches, weighs 8 pounds when wet, and smells like the sheep it came from. Underneath, you might wear a linen shift if you're lucky. If you're not, congratulations. You are inventing chafing in real time. Pants? Only for men. Women wore long dresses, also wool, also itchy, with the added bonus of dragging through every puddle and chicken coop you pass. And speaking of puddles, let's talk about shoes. If you owned any, they were made of leather, barely stitched, and more symbolic than supportive. Arch support? A myth. Waterproofing? Only in your dreams. Most peasants went barefoot, regardless of weather, terrain, or dignity. Socks? Rare. Gloves? Luxury. Underwear? Optional, and not recommended during plague season. So what happens when your only tunic gets dirty? You wear it anyway. Laundry was a monumental task. It involved hauling water from a stream, heating it over a fire, scrubbing clothes with lye or ashes, and beating them against rocks or washboards, all while hoping the rain holds off and the pigs don't steal your drying linens. As a result, people washed their clothes seasonally, like crops, maybe 4 times a year, maybe less, and even then, not every item made the cut. You focused on what smelled worst or visibly moved. Stains were permanent, odors were expected, and mending was a constant hobby. You stitched holes with whatever thread you had and hoped the patch didn't fall off mid-feast. In fact, clothes were so valuable they were passed down in wills. Imagine being left your uncle's threadbare tunic and reacting with genuine gratitude. For the wealthy, things got more colorful, literally. They had dyed fabrics, fancy embroidery, and outfits for specific events. But even nobles didn't change daily. Clothes were rotated slowly, carefully, and aired out in between. Perfume was used not just on the body, but on clothing to mask decay. And lice? They didn't care about class. Everyone itched. Nobles had servants to comb out nits. Peasants had wooden lice combs, which they used, then shared, then used again. It was a whole thing. Entire monastic rules were written about when it was spiritually acceptable to delouse yourself. So yes, fashion was different. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about making it through the month without your sleeves falling off. And somehow, amid the mud, the bugs, and the raw wool, people still found joy. A stitched flower here, a hand-dyed collar there. Proof that even in the darkest ages, someone was still trying to look a little cute while hauling manure. Bathing in the Middle Ages was a bit like a solar eclipse, rare, confusing, and not always welcomed by the church. To begin with, yes, people did bathe. Let's put that myth to bed along with your medieval pillow, which was probably a sack of straw with opinions. Cleanliness was valued, just not how we value it today. Modern daily showers would have seemed bizarre, luxurious, or possibly grounds for suspicion. For most folks, a full-body bath was a special event, somewhere between a spa day and an exorcism. It required planning, effort, and enough boiling water to stage a small siege. Let's walk through it. You start by hauling water, buckets, many of them. If you lived near a stream or, well, lucky you only had to trudge through mud and livestock traffic. Then you boiled the water over a fire, which could take hours, especially if your firewood was damp or recently stolen by a neighbor with strong calves and poor morals. Once hot, the water was poured into a wooden tub, usually set up in the kitchen, the only room that could double as a sauna. The tub might leak. It definitely creaked. And by the time you filled it, the water was already cooling. Families often shared the same bath, in order of status or age. Father first, then mother, then children, and finally the baby, who bathed in a cloudy mix of herbal oils, leftover grit, and someone else's ankle soot. By the end, it was less a bath and more a broth, with hints of rosemary. Possibly regret. Soap, as we've discussed, was made from animal fat and ashes, sometimes perfumed with herbs if you had the coin. Scrubbing was minimal, mostly a gentle slosh and a hasty rinse. Linger too long, and you'd be accused of luxury or moral weakness. Modesty was important, even when no one could see anything through the steam. Public bathhouses existed, particularly in cities like London, Paris, and Cologne. Some were elegant affairs with heated pools, individual stalls, and even snacks. Others, well, let's just say, if the walls could talk, they'd immediately be censored by the local bishop. Because, yes, bathing had baggage. The church, ever vigilant, viewed public baths with suspicion. Too much skin, too much gossip, too many opportunities for unchristian mingling. By the 14th and 15th centuries, bathhouses were being shut down across Europe, not due to hygiene concerns, but moral panic. Cleanliness might be next to godliness, but only if done alone and without smiling. Plagues didn't help either. As disease swept through Europe, many believed that bathing opened the pores, allowing sickness to enter. Suddenly, the, quote, protective layer of filth was fashionable. Some even carried pomanders, little scented balls, to hold under their noses as mobile air fresheners. Bath less, smell more, survive the plague. That was the logic. Still, bath rituals persisted. Monks had scheduled washing days. Nobles bathed with attendants. Peasants made do with a rinse in the river, while keeping one eye out for leeches, eels, or judgmental ducks. And despite the effort, a clean body was a source of pride. Weddings, feasts, and religious holidays were all reasons to scrub up, even if it meant spending the entire day boiling water and explaining to your in-laws why the goat was in the tub first. In our world, bedtime might involve brushing your teeth, scrolling through your phone, and debating whether that shadow in the corner is your bathrobe or a ghost. In the medieval world, bedtime came with one big question. What if I don't wake up? You see, going to bed in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was spiritually dangerous. The night belonged to God, yes, but also to demons, plague, sin, and sometimes cats with questionable motives. So before they closed their eyes, medieval folks engaged in rituals designed to protect the soul during sleep. It was like setting a spiritual home alarm system, without the blinking lights, but with a lot more Latin. The most common ritual? Prayer. Even the illiterate knew a few essential lines, short, direct, and mildly terrifying. You've likely heard one version, still whispered by nervous children. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sounds cute, until you realize it's a contract with God, negotiated nightly. Imagine falling asleep every evening with the same emotional tone as writing a will. More devout folks had longer routines. Monks and nuns ended the day with Compline, the final prayer service, often sung or chanted in the chapel, before returning to their communal dormitory. After Compline came the great silence. No talking, no distractions. Just the quiet creak of straw mattresses and Brother Ambrose's legendary snoring. But even common folk had bedtime customs. Some would sprinkle holy water on their bed or hang protective charms above the door. Amulets, saint medallions, or a tiny pouch of salt and herbs. Think of it as a medieval dream catcher, but less Pinterest-friendly. Why all the drama? Because night was dangerous. People died in their sleep all the time. Fevers, bad air, unknown illnesses, sudden heartaches. And if you died without confessing your sins or praying, well, let's just say your post-bedtime itinerary got a bit warmer. Children were taught bedtime prayers early, partly to calm them, partly to give parents 5 minutes of silence before being woken again by a goat stepping on someone's face. Sleep was also when dreams arrived. And in medieval thought, dreams weren't brain static. They were messages, some divine, others demonic. A good dream might mean you're blessed. A bad dream? Time to see a priest. And finally, there was the practical side. Preparing the room, close the shutters, check the fire. Make sure the livestock wasn't in the bed again. Some slept with knives under their pillows for protection. Others with rosaries or bits of relics or whatever object they believed had divine Wi-Fi. And then, wrapped in your one damp wool blanket, under a thatched roof, between two coughing relatives, you closed your eyes and hoped to wake up on the same side of heaven. Which, all things considered, makes our nightlights and heated blankets feel pretty luxurious. In today's world, dreams are mostly shrugged off. Maybe a weird blur of faces, cheese, and that one high school exam you forgot to study for. But in the Middle Ages, dreams were anything but random. They were serious business. Dangerous, holy, confusing business. To the medieval mind, sleep was not a passive escape from life. It was a moment when the soul wandered, untethered from the body. And when you dreamt, you weren't just imagining things. You were receiving messages. Sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil. Occasionally, from a very spicy meat pie. Let's break it down. There were 3 kinds of dreams, according to medieval scholars. Visio, a true vision, divine in origin. These dreams were taken extremely seriously and often ended up in church records, especially if they involved angels, saints, or helpful dead relatives offering unsolicited advice. Somnium, the standard dream, symbolic, confusing, maybe prophetic. These were analyzed like medieval Rorschach tests. If you dreamed of fire, was it hellfire, a warning? Or just that you were sleeping too close to the hearth again? Insomnium, dreams caused by food, fever, or foolishness. These were less spiritually significant and more, you shouldn't have eaten that goat liver so late. Interpreting dreams was an art form. There were books, entire dream dictionaries, used by monks, scholars, and occasionally nosy neighbors. Did you dream of teeth falling out? Might be death. Dream of flying? Could be spiritual ascension, or perhaps indigestion and arrogance. And let's not forget the demonic dream, a nightmare not born of stress, but of temptation. The devil was thought to sneak into dreams to whisper bad ideas, spark sinful thoughts, or confuse the soul. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, read, mildly interesting, it was often followed by confession, fasting, or a stern talking to from a priest who definitely had opinions about your subconscious. Some dreams were treated as divine revelations. Visionary nuns like Hildegard of Bingen wrote entire theological treatises based on their nighttime revelations. Kings and warriors sometimes made decisions, big ones, based on dreams. Battles, marriages, conquests, all because someone saw a glowing sword in the sky while napping in a barn. Of course, not all dreams were welcome. If you had recurring nightmares, people assumed your soul was under attack, or that you'd recently made a bad deal with a relic vendor. Charms, prayers, and even exorcisms were prescribed for those haunted by dream demons. And just in case you were wondering, lucid dreaming? Yes. Medieval texts describe dreams where the sleeper knows they're dreaming. But instead of, "I can fly," it was more like, "I must find the bishop and ask what this fish-headed man means." Still, for all the fear and awe, there was comfort too. Dreams were one of the only ways the average medieval person could feel connected to the divine or glimpse the mysteries of the world beyond. Even if that glimpse involved talking goats and flaming swords. If you've ever let your dog sleep at the foot of your bed and thought, "Is this too much?" Rest easy. You're part of a very long tradition. In the Middle Ages, people didn't just share their beds with pets, they shared them with livestock. And not just for companionship. Not even primarily for companionship. The primary reason was simple: heating. Let's talk physics. Medieval homes, especially peasant cottages, were drafty, stone-walled, and about as well insulated as a wicker basket in a snowstorm. Fireplaces helped, sure, but firewood was expensive, and cutting down the Lord's trees without permission was the kind of bold career move that ended in a noose. So instead, people brought their animals indoors: cows, pigs, goats, chickens, dogs. Sometimes all at once. The animals gave off body heat. They breathed, they farted, they snored, and somehow all of this made life more bearable. If you had a cow sleeping in the corner, it might raise the room temperature by a few degrees, which in January could mean the difference between waking up with frostbite or just a mild case of regret. Beds were often communal. Parents, children, guests, everyone piled in. And in the corner, a dog or two curled up for warmth, chickens roosting near the ceiling beams. And maybe a pig snorting gently in its sleep, like a living, grumpy space heater. This wasn't weird. This was practical. Animals were your heating system, your alarm clock, and occasionally your source of nighttime drama. Imagine rolling over and finding a hoof in your back, or waking up to find a goose has laid an egg on your blanket. Medieval mornings were eventful. In towns, inns operated like human and animal bunkhouses. You'd rent a bed or a spot in one, and might find yourself sharing it with a stranger, their chicken, and their cousin. No one blinked. Privacy was a myth. Comfort was optional. Of course, this wasn't hygienic. Animals brought fleas, lice, and, let's say, unplanned surprises. Bedding had to be beaten out regularly. Floors swept. It didn't eliminate the bugs, but it kept the population in check. Barely. For the wealthy, this wasn't as common. Nobles had separate stables and kennels, but even they might sleep with lapdogs. Small, fluffy companions, more decorative than practical, but still good for flea distribution. And yes, flea collars existed, not for pets, but for people. Little rings or necklaces filled with herbs, meant to repel insects, or at least distract them long enough for you to sleep through the night. So next time you grumble about a cat stepping on your face at 3 a.m., think of your medieval ancestors. They had pigs stealing their blankets, roosters crowing at nothing, and lice that considered humans a permanent residence. And yet somehow they slept. Probably out of exhaustion, possibly out of hope. If medieval peasant sleep was chaotic and cozy, then monastic sleep was the opposite. Austere, silent, and designed to make sure you never forgot you were mortal. Welcome to the dormitory of a medieval monastery, where dozens of robed men sleep in rows. No talking, no privacy, and absolutely no fluff. Let's set the scene. The room is long and narrow, lined with wooden platforms, not beds. Platforms. Some have thin straw mats, others just folded woolen cloaks, no pillows, no curtains. No decoration. Your luxury items here include a small blanket and the knowledge that you'll be waking up in 4 hours. Everyone sleeps in their robes. Why? Because if God calls at 2 a.m. or Brother Cuthbert farts loud enough to startle a bat, you don't want to be scrambling for pants in the dark. Lighting is minimal. Maybe one candle at the far end of the hall. Just enough to remind you not to sin, but not enough to help you find your slippers. And the smell? Not terrible, but certainly monastic. A heady mix of beeswax, old wool, sandalwood, and the spiritual fatigue of men who haven't bathed since Advent. Before sleep, monks attend Compline, the final prayer service of the day. Then, back to the dorm, where the great silence begins. No chatting, no good nights. No last-minute gossip about who dropped the bread during Mass. Silence was sacred. A way to quiet not just the room, but the soul. Even sleep was part of religious discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monasteries, recommended about 6 hours of sleep, split between matins, a pre-dawn service that required everyone to wake up in the middle of the night, shuffle half asleep into the chapel, chant psalms by candlelight, and try not to fall over. Some stricter orders took it further, sleeping, sitting up, sleeping in shifts, or even avoiding lying down entirely, because if it felt good, it was probably a sin. Dreams? Treated with extreme caution, a vivid dream might be a sign of divine favor or demonic temptation. Monks recorded dreams in journals, sometimes seeking advice from superiors. But they were also warned not to trust dreams too much, because what seems like an angel might just be indigestion and a guilty conscience. Hygiene? Minimal. Bathing was rare, lice were common, and scratching was done discreetly, ideally during non-liturgical hours. Some monasteries permitted one communal bath per season. Others did not. Still, there was a strange comfort in the simplicity. You didn't worry about clothes, money, or choosing the right pillow. Life was pared down to prayer, sleep, and the occasional turnips, and in its own quiet way, that was peace. So if you ever find yourself unable to sleep, restless and scrolling, imagine lying on a hard wooden plank, wrapped in a robe, surrounded by snoring monks, waiting for a bell to remind you it's time to pray again. Because sometimes, less is holier. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace. The air is thick with the smell of open fish stalls, sweating horses, damp wool, and the ever-present perfume of public waste. It's a smell that doesn't so much greet you as grapple you by the throat. Now imagine one person passing through it all, dressed in layers, face serene, surrounded by a faint cloud of rose water and cloves. A rare scent, a statement, a shield. Because in the Middle Ages, when soap was scarce and bathing suspicious, the next best thing was to mask the smell. And thus was born the fragrant world of medieval scent strategies, perfumes, palm odors, herbs, and holy smoke. Let's start with perfume. Far from being just a luxury, perfume was often viewed as a kind of hygiene in a bottle. If you couldn't scrub away the filth, you could at least confuse it. Distilled floral waters, especially rose, lavender, and orange blossom, were popular among the wealthy. Not just dabbed on the skin, but poured into laundry, sprinkled on floors, or wafted around the room like olfactory armor. And because perfume was expensive, requiring distillation equipment and a lot of flower petals, it was also status. The richer you smelled, the less people assumed you were crawling with mites. And, more importantly, the more likely you were to escape judgment for not bathing this quarter. Then there were pomanders. These were the medieval version of portable air fresheners. A pomander was a small, often ornately decorated metal ball, worn on a chain or tucked into a pocket. Inside, it held a fragrant mix of herbs, resins, spices, and sometimes wax. The word comes from the French pomme d'ambre, apple of amber, referring to ambergris, a prized, and let's be honest, bizarre, substance found in the intestines of sperm whales used to stabilize scent. Pomanas were everywhere, worn around the neck, hung from belts, carried in gloves, even tied to bedposts to fight the musty ghosts of laundry day long past. But this wasn't just about smelling good. It was about protection. You see, medieval medicine believed in something called the miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread through bad air. Foul smells weren't just unpleasant, they were deadly. To inhale a bad odor was to invite illness into your lungs. So carrying a pomander wasn't vanity, it was medicine. A defense system. Some physicians wore long robes with scented linings, or sniffed sponges soaked in vinegar and herbs when visiting the sick. And during plagues, entire households would burn aromatic herbs like rosemary or thyme to cleanse the air. Let's not forget the church either. Incense played a double role, both spiritual and sanitary. Frankincense and myrrh were used in churches, not only to honor the divine, but also to mask the aroma of dozens of unwashed pilgrims huddled under one roof. Holy smoke with very practical benefits. And for the common folk, they did what they could. Herbs and flowers were strewn on floors, especially in spring. These rushes weren't just decorative. They released scent when stepped on, making the whole house smell marginally less like a sheep's lunch. Popular floor herbs included sweet woodruff, marjoram, and meadowsweet, which sounds like a fairy's garden but was actually your medieval version of Febreze. Even clothing was scented, if not with perfume, then with smoke. Many homes had smoke holes, and as clothes hung near the fire to dry, they picked up a natural aroma of wood smoke and ash. Rustic? Absolutely. But compared to what you might otherwise smell like, it was practically Chanel. And let's talk about mouth scent for a moment. Without toothbrushes, many people relied on chewing herbs like parsley, mint, or fennel. This freshened the breath, or at least gave it some complexity. For the upper class, there were clove-studded oranges, scented handkerchiefs, and candied anise seeds offered at feasts. All served the same purpose, to keep dinner conversation from turning into a test of endurance. So while hygiene as we know it was limited, the effort was real. They masked, they misted, they hoped for the best. And the next time you spritz yourself with perfume or light a scented candle, remember, you're not just indulging. You're continuing an ancient, desperate, beautifully human tradition, trying not to smell like the 14th century. You might think skincare is a modern obsession. Serums, masks, 10-step routines, and influencers who whisper about collagen. But medieval folks had their own ideas about beauty, skin health, and keeping one's face attached in an era without dermatologists. Spoiler, some of those ideas were alarming. Some were adorable. And some would make your modern esthetician leap from a tower in despair. Let's begin with the basics. Soap, as previously discussed, was rare, rough, and more of a philosophy than a product. So when it came to cleaning the face, most people used warm water, maybe a linen cloth, and the occasional herbal infusion. If you were fancy or desperate, you might reach for some goat's milk, believed to soften the skin and keep it gentle as a blessed lamb, mildly effective, slightly smelly. But cleansing was just step one. The medieval world was full of ointments, balms, and salves, some medicinal, some cosmetic, most highly experimental. Let's take a walk through the medieval skincare aisle. Honey and vinegar, a classic. Honey was antiseptic and sticky. Vinegar was believed to tighten the skin and ward off blemishes. Together? Possibly effective, possibly terrifying. Rose water, genuinely lovely. Distilled from rose petals, this was used to refresh the face, cleanse wounds, and smell divine. It was a favorite in monasteries, noble households, and among anyone who had a vague sense of hygiene. Snail slime. Yes, you read that correctly. Crushed snails, or just their excretions, were recommended for treating skin inflammation, burns, and in some cases, wrinkles. You'd mash up a few snails, mix them with herbs, and apply the result to your face. Slow beauty, medieval edition. Egg whites, used as a kind of early face mask. The goal? Tighter skin, fewer blemishes, and a complexion so smooth you might be mistaken for a saint in a stained glass window. Or an omelet. But medieval skincare wasn't just about smoothness. It was about piety, purity, and sometimes outright fear. Pale skin was prized, not because people feared tanning, but because pale meant noble. You didn't toil in fields. You weren't exposed to the sun. Your skin was practically a social class. So to maintain that glow, people went to wild lengths. Some women applied powders made from white lead, ground pearls, or chalk to their faces. And yes, lead was toxic, but it created a flawless look, right up until your skin started peeling off. Others turned to herbal whiteners, mixtures of licorice root, cucumber, or marshmallow plant. These were milder, safer, and probably smelled like a salad. For those battling acne, medieval physicians had suggestions like washing your face with urine, your own preferably aged, applying onion paste with wine, or rubbing crushed basil and lard on the affected area. Did it work? Sometimes. Was it worth the social cost of smelling like a condemned soup? That's debatable. And let's not forget the monastic angle. Monks and nuns often created their own salves, many quite sophisticated. Using beeswax, olive oil, herbs like calendula or plantain, and sometimes a dash of spiritual intent, these remedies were designed to heal skin wounds, burns, and, yes, the occasional rash from sleeping next to livestock. One famous 12th century abbess, Hildegard of Bingen, wrote entire treatises on healing and skin care, blending spiritual wisdom with surprisingly advanced herbal science. Her recipe for a clear complexion involved fennel tea and joyful moderation, which, honestly, still holds up. Men weren't exempt from skincare rituals. Knights often returned from battle with chapped skin, windburn, and armor acne. Some applied pig fat or goose grease as a protective layer, essentially medieval Vaseline. Others just rubbed mud on their wounds and hoped for divine intervention. Did these routines work? Sometimes. Skin conditions in the Middle Ages were often poorly understood, leading to a wide mix of folk remedies, superstitions, and genuine herbal knowledge. But what they lacked in scientific method, they made up for in persistence. People cared about how they looked. They tried. They experimented. And sometimes, they accidentally invented moisturizers in the process. So the next time you're applying a $70 night cream, remember, you're not just pampering yourself. You're standing on the shoulders of onion-faced saints and snail-covered scholars. When we think of medieval romance, we often imagine chivalric knights wooing fair maidens with rose gardens, harp music, and overly long poems about eyes like the moon's reflection in a silver goblet. Charming, yes. Accurate? Not entirely. Because while love certainly bloomed in the Middle Ages, it often did so through a haze of sweat, stale clothing, and strategic applications of herbs that hopefully masked the smell of goat. Let's start with the most basic question. How did one prepare for a date in the 13th century? First, clothes. You didn't have many, so you made the best of what you had. Your nicest tunic, your least stained overgown, a belt cinched just so to suggest, I own land. Clothes might be scented by drying them near fragrant herbs like lavender, thyme, or sweet rush. If you had a perfume or floral water, even better. A splash of rose water on the wrists could turn heads, or at least make someone lean closer without wincing. Then, hair. Hair care was surprisingly important. Both men and women oiled their hair with herbal infusions or animal fat, glamorous, and combed it frequently, partly for style, mostly to fight lice. Combs were fine-toothed, often carved from bone, and passed down like heirlooms. A man who combed regularly was not just stylish, he was respectable, possibly even marriage material. Teeth? Let's not get too romantic here. Medieval mouths were rough territory, but there were attempts at fresh breath. Parsley, fennel seeds, mint leaves, or even cloves if you could afford them. Kissing wasn't the main romantic gesture. It was rare, reserved, and done very discreetly. which was a blessing for all involved. Now, on to courtship gifts. Forget flowers from the market stall. Medieval lovers exchanged herbal sachets, bundles of scented plants, often stitched into small cloth pouches. These could be worn around the neck or tucked into clothes. Personal, practical, and a low-key way of saying, "I hope you smell better." Embroidered handkerchiefs, not just for waving from castle windows. These were often perfumed and carried during festivals or dances. A man might return it to a woman after holding it during a tournament, ideally without blood on it. Love tokens, rings, brooches, or even locks of hair, often tied with ribbons and, yes, scented. Because nothing says devotion like carrying your beloved's hair beside your sweaty undergarments. And, of course, there were love potions. These weren't just about magic. They were sometimes herbal brews meant to freshen the breath, improve complexion, or give you that energetic glow of someone who slept next to fewer pigs than usual. Ingredients ranged from charming, rose petals, honey, to suspicious, ground toad parts, wild boar sweat. Most didn't work. Some made you ill. A few resulted in awkward conversations with clergy. Medieval flirting itself was an art form, subtle gestures, coded language, and eye contact levels that would seem hilariously shy today. A glance across the feast hall, a shared cup at the well, a poem slipped between loaves of bread. Cleanliness played a role in all of it. Not perfection, but effort. A well-combed head. Fresh herbs sewn into a collar. Shoes that didn't squelch. These small acts sent a clear message. I care. About myself. About you. About not reeking. And when a relationship progressed, say, to betrothal, the family might insist on a bath. A full bath. With herbs, hot water, and possibly a second rinse, just to be sure. Because even in a time before deodorant, toothpaste, or date night playlists, people still knew the value of showing up clean-ish and smelling slightly like thyme. Picture a knight in gleaming armor, riding a snorting war horse, his cape billowing heroically behind him. It's all very noble. Until you realize he's been wearing the same underwear for 6 weeks, hasn't bathed since the last truce, and currently smells like hot leather, dried blood, and disappointment. Welcome to the hygiene horrors of medieval warfare. Let's start with the basics. Armor. A full suit of plate armor could weigh anywhere from 45 to 65 pounds, depending on your status, wealth, and whether you planned on actually surviving battle. Underneath all that metal, a knight wore a gambeson, a thick quilted jacket designed to cushion blows and prevent chafing, and under that, a linen shirt if he was lucky. Sometimes just skin. Now imagine wearing that ensemble for days. In summer, on horseback, while swinging a sword. The sweat? Biblical. The odor? Best left to the imagination. And bathing? Rare to non-existent on campaign. Armor wasn't just hot. It was tricky to remove. You didn't just take it off. You needed servants, time, and ideally no one trying to kill you. So unless you were safely back at camp or in the castle, you stayed suited up, which meant that dirt, sweat, and blood formed a lovely crust under your armor, often leading to sores, rashes, and the medieval soldier's best friend, boils. Knights weren't the only ones suffering. Foot soldiers, archers, and mercenaries had it worse. They didn't have armor or servants. They slept in fields, ate whatever was available, stale bread, dried meat, regret, and bathed only when they fell into a river by accident. Hygiene was not just an afterthought, it was a luxury. So how did they manage? Well, they didn't, but they tried. Soldiers often carried combs, pouches of herbs, and the occasional tin of salve. These were used to fight lice, ease chafed skin, and deal with minor wounds. Some armies included barber surgeons, who, besides pulling teeth and sawing off infected limbs, also lanced boils and applied mustard plasters to unfortunate armpits. Water, if available, might be used to wash the face or clean wounds, but full bathing? Not unless you stumbled across a stream, and even then, you had to weigh the risks of being stabbed while naked. And speaking of risks, latrines. Battlefield camps had no plumbing. Soldiers relieved themselves in ditches, forests, or near rivers. Sorry, fish. This led to contamination, disease, and a general aroma of doom. Dysentery, typhoid, and infections spread rapidly. You could survive a battle, only to die from what followed. One chronicler noted that during the siege of Antioch, First Crusade, more soldiers died of filth and disease than enemy arrows. And that's saying something, considering the arrows were frequent and enthusiastic. But hygiene wasn't always ignored. In some professional armies, like the Byzantines or Islamic forces, there were strict hygiene protocols. Soldiers were required to wash regularly, clean their gear, and keep latrines away from water sources. Even the Templars had rules: clean clothes, scheduled baths, and no spitting in shared water jugs. Progress. And when the fighting ended, bathing returned, at least for the survivors. Knights returning from campaigns might soak in herb-infused tubs, have their wounds treated, and finally remove that gambeson, now so stiff with sweat it could stand on its own. Yet despite the grime, soldiers were often admired. Tales of valor, loyalty, and glory circulated faster than complaints about smell. Because let's be honest, history is written by poets, not noses. So the next time you hear about gallant knights and noble battles, spare a thought for the underlayer. Beneath every chivalrous charge was a man held together by leather straps, ambition, and the faint hope of a bath before Christmas. Let's begin with a simple truth. Being a kid in the Middle Ages was hard. You were expected to grow up fast, work young, and avoid dying from things like infected splinters or suspicious cheese. And while modern children have baths, baby wipes, and entire product lines for gentle skin, medieval kids had linen scraps, buckets, and grandmothers with a firm grip and a cold sponge. So let's start at the beginning. Diapers. Medieval babies weren't just left to their own devices. They were swaddled tightly. From birth until several months old, infants were wrapped like small woolly burritos in long bands of cloth. The goal was warmth, safety, and to keep their limbs straight, a holdover from ancient beliefs that babies could grow crooked if left to wiggle freely. As for what happened inside those swaddles, well, they didn't change them frequently, sometimes once a day, maybe less if the child wasn't crying. Diaper rash wasn't a possibility. It was a permanent feature. Parents might sprinkle herbs or ashes inside the cloth to reduce irritation. Or just air the child out like a medieval laundry flag when the weather was warm, bathing the baby. It was done, but not daily. A full bath might happen weekly, with warm water in a shallow basin, and herbs like chamomile or lavender added to calm both baby and mother. Soap was often too harsh, so they used milk, oats, or just a prayer and a rinse. Teething was another milestone of medieval discomfort. To ease the pain, parents gave children wooden beads to chew on, cloth soaked in wine, yes, wine, or rubbed the gums with sage, salt, or honey, which, as it turns out, is not recommended for infants today, but they didn't get that memo. Children's health was managed with a mix of folk remedies, saintly prayers, and the occasional trip to a local healer. If your toddler had lice, which they probably did, you might rub onion juice into their scalp or shave their head entirely. Girls usually kept long braids, boys short crops. Both were checked regularly for creepy crawlies. For toddlers and older kids, hygiene became more negotiable. These kids were playing outside, helping with chores, chasing pigs, and occasionally falling into wells. They got filthy, and parents often took a scrub them when they start to smell approach. Washing hands before meals? Ideal, not guaranteed. Children often ate with dirty hands, sometimes straight from communal bowls. Table manners weren't expected until older. Napkins were for the rich. Peasants used sleeves. Or nothing. Brushing teeth? Unheard of. But chewing on twigs or herbal stalks was common. Sage, mint, and even licorice root. Not for dental care, but because they tasted nice and kept the mouth busy. Hair washing? Only when desperate. Maybe once a month. Boys often had their heads shaved during summer to combat lice. Girls, hair was brushed and braided, a daily ritual that doubled as lice inspection and bonding time. It also helped that long braids were easier to keep tidy than short, wild curls. And then there were the tiny accidents. Cuts, scrapes, and mysterious rashes were everywhere. Kids were treated with garlic poultices, animal fat rubs, or simply tied up bundles of herbs pinned to their clothes to draw out the bad humors. Band-aids? Not a thing. Just dirt, cloth, and a very patient goat. The truth is, children were expected to be dirty, not just accepted, respected. A muddy child was a healthy child. One who'd been outside, working, learning, surviving. And once a year, during major religious festivals, they were all scrubbed down properly, hair combed, nails trimmed, ears cleaned with wool. That was your clean slate. Until next harvest season,